Thank you, Stephen. We have a handful of questions that have come in. I'll remind everyone, if you have questions you'd like to ask of Steve, please type them into the Q&A panel at the right and address them to all panelists. So Steve, I'll start out with a couple questions and read through them. We've got one here. Is this a standard practice within Fluor or something we do on all of our projects, or is it dependent on the client?
Well, to be honest, a lot depends on the client. We do find, for example, the government of the United States, the government of Canada is very into statistical analysis. Some clients, it's not as important. So it's not across all of our projects, but even if the client isn't pushing for it, hopefully I've shown some advantages of incorporating it in some of your critical metrics.
Okay, great. How do you avoid confusing correlation and causation?
Yes, that is definitely part of the context. So I can get now what this is a standard question of if two things happen. For example, drownings are correlated to ice cream sales. This is a real thing. More ice cream is sold, there's more drownings at the beach. Well, the issue is there's a common cause behind that, which is summer heat. I buy more ice cream in the summer. I do more swimming in the summer. So I have a correlation, but there's an underlying causation. So this is why it's so important. If I get a signal and say one of these things is not like the other, I do have to go in and say, do I understand where that came from, or is that just kind of a underlying correlation? Another thing to do, remember the name of the game is prediction. So if I do see a correlation that I haven't been able to find causation for, I can make a prediction that says these two things are correlated and monitor that data and make the prediction that these things will go together. And if over the course of the next, say, 6 data points, I still see the correlation, I may not understand the cause, but I made a prediction and the prediction was true, so that validates, there's something going on here.
Okay, great. So Steve, here another question maybe specific to safety or accidents. In the U.S., is it legally allowed to share safety incident and root cause analysis by law between companies? Do we benchmark against similar industries or situational issues in our database?
Well, actually, benchmarking, I mentioned the U.S. Voluntary Protection Program. That is an attribute of that program that you should be benchmarking yourself against others. And if you do go to Bureau of Labor Statistics, you will find many reports that are accumulated across the United States, and I'm sure other countries do this too, which will tell you common causes such as ergonomics versus struck by object and common body parts. So yes, that is a good thing to share information, and we do try to do that. That's why we have the GIMS, the central injury management system across Fluor, so we can easily retrieve that information for ourselves, and we can go to sources like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and see how we compare.
Great. So, Steve, is there a rule of thumb for how you decide to display data? Are there specific do's and don'ts in coming to that conclusion?
Well, display of the data does get interesting. You would think that being a statistician is a pretty boring job, that you just put data in a pot, you turn the crank, you get the data out, you give it to your manager, and life is good. And life is good if you're saying, oh, things are great and wonderful, which I've had the experience of doing. Now, the tough thing is trying to go and say, we have a risk here. We have something going on here. That's where the communication skills gets rather needed. And as far as context of display of charts, I do obviously trust my statistical process control, but when it comes to if I'm going to make a presentation to the U.S. Congress or to a client, we will somewhat simplify that information to say, well, here's my rates by year, which I achieved because I did the underlying statistical analysis and understood my causes. Now, some clients, as I say, like the Federal Railway Administration, just love to see the level of detail we had in our data. So sometimes don't be afraid to show the data. I guess one more thing, if I may, is a lot of people ask, well, my workers will never understand this. Now, I've dealt with a lot of workers. I really like dealing with workers. And you go to the worker and say, well, here's a display of, what the output of the process has been. And they're like, gee, we've been trying to convince management of this, that we got an underlying problem for years now. Well, this is great. You've nailed it. So it becomes a communication tool between the people who are the willing workers and the management to say, well, here's a way of looking at your results and saying, okay, what can we do?
Okay, great. So another question related to safety: how does safety data trends, or how do safety data trends account for the severity of a given incident, or if it's a near miss? Can you develop actions or recommend actions due to the high amount of a small accident, or maybe the intent is a near miss on that question?
Very good question. Hopefully, everybody is aware of the iceberg or the pyramid model, where we say, I have my very visible results, in this case, injuries, days away from work, even OSHA recordable or company reportable events are the tip of the iceberg. But yes, under the water, unseen, are all these near misses. And I do tend to find most classes of injuries, recordable injury is a first aid case, but for a roll of the dice. I am just putting a Band-Aid on my cut because I only scraped the surface of my skin versus cutting it deeply enough to need stitches. The one place I've noticed that doesn't correlate well is with insect bites. We fortunately don't tend to get a lot of recordable insect bites. I'm sure somebody's raising their hand, and I once saw a picture at a safety meeting of a very gory, infected insect bite. So yes, I know they can, but if you understand the mechanisms, usually a recordable injury is just a first aid case, but for a relatively unlucky random result. Now, even better than waiting on first aid cases is to get out there and do observations. And so that, for example, many projects I've been involved with do behavior-based observation. Hey, you're doing that cutting of that thing you're cutting without wearing gloves and without wearing the right kind of gloves. So now I've even headed off the behavior of, gee, you could end up with a cut because your hand is unprotected. And so by doing behavior-based safety observations, I can help to prevent those things. That's near the bottom of the pyramid. Also is very standard in Fluor, we do call for housekeeping inspections. So are there tripping hazards laying around? Do your knives, are they stored with proper blade protection? So I look at my conditions of housekeeping inspections. That's also very good, and the trend. We invoked a program like that at Hanford, and we found one of the things that about 2 or 3% of the time, our actual protective equipment, our personal protective equipment, aka PPE, wasn't being stored properly. So if your harness for working for heights is deteriorated because it wasn't stored right, or your gloves are all in terrible shape, they're not going to protect you. So those are things that I can trend and look at. Okay, where do I have issues with PPE storage? Go out and look. That is, again, the soft is hard, hard is soft. Go out and look and see what these conditions are, so you're not waiting for the lagging indicator of a recordable cut or laceration that needed stitches.
Great, Steve. A couple more questions here coming in, perhaps outside of safety, but I'll read it. I'll start with one here. Can Fluor use statistical process control to identify and correct root causes for project delays?
Of course. Of course. You're asking a statistician, should I use SPC? And my answer is going to be, why not? Who would not want to understand that? So if I do have my project data or data across several projects, and I've done individual causal analysis of each of those delays or missed opportunities, or even the good opportunities, I can put that into a statistical process control analysis with supporting Pareto charts and say, well, this is our trend in certain behaviors. To use a corrective maintenance analogy, we had a lot of work stoppages at one location, and we tried to find out, well, why were the work stoppages occurring? And collection of that in a Pareto chart, which ranked them, said that our subject matter expert human health physics technicians are not showing up at the job site. And then we asked the question, well, why is that occurring? And we didn't have enough of them, and they were being overscheduled. So yes, I can accumulate this data together at the very high level, be it, project delivery, or the very low level of corrective maintenance, and say what leads to my negative outcomes. Now be careful, because if you need to look at all outcomes, because for example, there's been cases of where, say, I've had bearing failures, and they analyze the failed bearings and go, oh, there's a contaminant in the oil. So they go to all this work to try to get rid of the contamination in the oil. But if they had analyzed the good bearings, they also had the same contaminant. There was something else going on. So statistical analysis and understanding your data can really lead to significant project improvements.
Okay, great. Steve, here maybe somewhat of a follow-up question on that, but how do project teams convert these trends into budget or some type of contingency plan?
Yes. Oh, that, definitely the whole idea of contingency plan at the higher level, they do tend to use what they call Monte Carlo analysis and critical path, or even PERT, which will say, what is my uncertainty? And we get away from, well, this is, especially if you were dealing with firm fixed price, is how do I set that price where I can have enough margin for my uncertainties, yet not price myself out of the market. So this is where the pricing capability becomes very important. And that I know has been going on with project management at Fluor also, with my counterparts, especially at Stork, in operations and maintenance.
Great. So question on perhaps advancements. How are advancements in data analytics affecting the field you work in, Stephen, and what does the future of statistical process control look like to you?
Well, the future is, in my opinion, statistical process control exists in a certain sweet spot. I trained up the secretary to the vice president of safety and health at Hanford how to maintain charts, and she actually maintained 300 of my charts a month. Now, I had to mentor in terms of, hey, Steve, I just saw one of these 7 in a row the same side of the average. What do I do? But she was perfectly capable of maintaining these statistical process control charts. Japanese high school students learn how to make it. And hopefully I've demonstrated they're very visual and very easy to read. So we are kind of up the staircase from moving averages and pure counts. This has been a 10% change. Well, is that important or not? Or I love the COVID charts on the TV that change colors every week based upon, well, this week happened to be higher than last week. And you just kind of go, well, what's the real pattern here? So the SPC allows us to see that. Now, yes, there are some considerable advancements, especially in terms of data storage, in terms of programming. And I will say my master's degree thesis used something called logistic regression. There are some very high-level statistical tools where if you have a really tough problem, you can dig into with them. And that, I would say, is, yeah, those tools are out there. They help. But I use kind of the statistical process control as my Swiss Army knife. My handy dandy, it's understandable. I can see what's going on. Now, if I detect a trend or something and go, there's something underlying here, maybe I pull out logistic regression, which, in fact, my master's thesis was about a submarine system, and it managed to get my thesis actually got a paragraph in the tactical employment manual for that weapon system. So that was a very good start to my career. So statistical process control, I would put out as that sweet spot of it's not too hard for the non-statistician to do. It does require some mentoring to really get good at it, but it's a good display method. And yes, there certainly is the big data analytics that are out there that sometimes when my Swiss Army knife needs a little help, I can go to.
Steve, So one more question. I'm kind of paraphrasing some of these. I think this is probably in reference to, I believe it was slide 12. I think you went over some of the perhaps rules of thumb for trending.
Oh, yes, yes.
Have you ever come across instances where you've analyzed the data and maybe it was even the next slide?
Yes, it is.
But have you ever come across instances where the data is improving, you've done your analysis, and perhaps this, you're not able to come to the conclusion of what is causing it? Do you ever adjust the upper control limit or the lower control limit if things are getting better based on, I'll say, not being able to come to consensus as to what the root cause is?
This is one of those touchy subjects, and there's a good old rule of thumb from where I come from, which is believe your indications. And I cannot tell you how many times in 25 years a very frustrated manager comes to me and says, Steve, something's wrong with your chart. We've taken the actions and it doesn't say anything has changed. Well, sometimes you got to step back a minute and say, yes, you've probably done something, but truly we're not seeing any effect of it. And that's kind of the safety feature of statistical process control. I do know that there are some people who, depending on the risk, will say, well, sometimes we'll use 3 standard deviations, but we'll use 3.5 in this case, or 2.5 in that case. We want to be sensitive. And I just find that opens yourself up to too much arbitrary manipulation of the results in order to get the result you want. And that can be very dangerous. So yes, some patience is required. And I'll usually go, yeah, this is looking promising. Or I'll go, oh, we got 6 points, the correct side of the average, or 1 month away from an improving trend. So we can, and this is where the leading indicator helps. So if you've done an improvement, we ought to have a leading indicator of that activity of doing the improvement. So I can say, yes, I'm doing that activity, but we still need the result indicator of, but did it make any difference?
Okay, that was a great explanation. Steve, it looks like we have time for one more question. This one looks like it's coming back to safety. Is there any light you can shed on failures or injuries due to fatigue?
Yes. Fatigue is what we would call as a common cause situation. Shift work, and I've been a shift worker myself. That is another source of fatigue. I wish I had a way to measure fatigue, a little fatigue meter to plug into people's arms. But actually, this is where now maybe I can do some surveys. I can actually go talk to workers. Maybe at the morning meeting, I go, how much sleep did people get? How do you feel today? That also expresses concern for the person, but it's also a data point in terms of, oh boy, my workers show up obviously very tired and very fatigued. Maybe I need to put in some compensatory actions. And perhaps I can even come up with some form of measurement. Now, not everything can be measured, but I can certainly say I see my workers are fatigued and therefore I need to do the following. But I can back that up with analysis. And if I do good human performance analysis of some of my near misses and events, I may discover that, yes, the human performance condition of fatigue is a source of these issues, and how do I deal with it? By mandatory rest rules, or I know in the Navy, the watch officer was required to go and check on the watch standards every 3 hours, no matter what time of day or night it was. That was a compensatory action. So good question. Good one to close on.
Right. Steve, those were excellent discussion there. It looks like that's all the time we've got available on the webinar for questions. So I want to thank you again, Stephen, for the time you have spent today and in preparation and the insightful discussion. I'd also like to thank our audience for attending today. You've been very engaging, and it's been a pleasure being your moderator. We will be hosting the next webinar on Thursday, December 10th at 10 a.m. Central Time. In this webinar, subject matter expert James Turney and Giovanna Pera will talk about the important considerations and benefits of designing new or revamping existing facilities to use more electricity instead of steam and fuel gas. Keep in touch with your Fluor contacts, follow our social media postings, or head to the Innovation Builders page on fluor.com to register for future webinars. We appreciate your attention and thank you again for dialing in today. We will send out a compiled list of the question and answers within a few days of this webinar, along with notification that the webinar recording is available for replay on fluor.com. If you have any questions or require additional information, please email us at innovation.builders@fluor.com and somebody from our team will get back to you. From all of us in the Innovation Builders team, have a safe day.